The night was quiet over Fort Callaway. The stars above the base were sharp and clear, the way they always looked in the high desert when the wind had pushed all the dust away. Colonel Nathan Graves stood outside the main building for a moment before heading back in, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold. He had a habit of doing that, stepping outside just to look at the sky before a long night shift. It helped him think. The stars never moved. They never changed. That was something he had always found comfortable about them. He went back inside at 0400 hours. He had no way of knowing that in 12 minutes, the sky was going to do something that no human being had ever seen before. Lieutenant Carla Owens was on the observation deck when it happened. She was 29 years old, sharp-eyed, and on her third cup of coffee for the night. She had pulled the late shift because she was covering for a friend, and she was tired in the slow, heavy way that comes not from one bad night, but from a whole string of them. She was staring at the western ridge without really seeing it when the sky above it changed color. It started as a faint shimmer, the kind of thing you might mistake for heat haze if it were not the middle of the night and well below freezing. Then the shimmer turned violet, a deep, pulsing violet that had no business being in any sky on Earth. Then the violet split. It opened up like a tear in a piece of old cloth, slowly at first, then all at once, and through the gap came something so large that Carla's brain refused to process it for a full 3 seconds. It was dark and angular and massive, and it moved through the opening with a slow, deliberate patience that was somehow more frightening than speed would have been. The sound it made did not come through the air. It came through the ground, a deep, low vibration that traveled up through the floor and into Carla's feet and chest and teeth. She hit the alarm before she had finished deciding to do it. Her hand moved on its own. Nathan was on the command deck in 4 minutes. He was still buttoning his jacket when he looked at the radar display and felt the floor shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with the vibration from outside. The return on the screen showed an object 3 kilometers long. It was decelerating. It was in the upper atmosphere. And it was broadcasting on every radio frequency available to human technology all at the same time, and in clear and unaccented English. "Attention! People of the planet designated Sol 3, the voice said. It was smooth and calm, the way a recorded announcement is calm. Your world has been chosen for absorption into the Vorath Continuum. Resistance is not advised. You have 72 of your hours to surrender your military forces and present your leaders for reassignment. Further instructions will follow." The message repeated 3 times and then stopped. Nobody on the command deck spoke for a moment. Then a young radar operator named Pete Walsh said very quietly, "Sir, there are more of them. Beyond the moon. I count 17 additional returns." Nathan looked at the screen. He looked at Carla. He looked back at the screen. "Get me the president," he said. "Get me every allied head of state. And find out who taught them English." The next 6 hours were the most chaotic in recorded human history. Every government on Earth was woken up. Every military command was put on full alert. Emergency sessions were called in parliaments and congresses and councils from one end of the planet to the other. The United Nations convened an emergency assembly at 3 in the morning New York time, with delegates joining by video link from hotel rooms and kitchens and cars, some of them still in their pajamas. Every major news channel in the world broke into its regular broadcast. Every social media platform collapsed under the weight of people trying to post about what they were seeing in the sky above their homes, because the ships were visible from the ground, not as clear shapes, not yet, but as steady, cold lights in the upper sky. Now, too large and too still to be anything natural. In Tokyo and Lagos and Sao Paulo and London, people stood in streets and on balconies and on rooftops and looked up and felt the same thing at the same time, a cold, open feeling in the chest that came from realizing that the world was a different size than it had been the day before. In a small diner on the edge of Tulsa, a retired mechanic named Dale Cooper was already up because he had never been much of a sleeper. He poured himself a black coffee and watched the television above the counter, where a news anchor was trying to explain what was happening in the sky over North America with the careful, measured voice of someone who was frightened but did not want to admit it on camera. Dale watched for a while. Then he looked out the window at the glow in the western sky. Pale and steady and wrong, and he said to no one in particular, "Well, that is going to be a real problem." He was not wrong about that. Back at Fort Callaway, Nathan had set up a direct line to the emergency command center beneath a mountain in Colorado. He was on his fourth call in 2 hours, this time with a general from the European Defense Command, when Carla came up behind him and held out a printed sheet without saying anything. He took it and read it. It was a translation analysis from the linguistics team, explaining that the Vorath broadcast had been in English, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, Russian, French, and Portuguese, all simultaneously, each on a different frequency, and that the translations were precise and idiomatic, not mechanical. Whoever had prepared that message had studied human language carefully and for a long time, which meant they had been watching, which meant this was not random. Nathan set the sheet down and looked at the radar display one more time. 18 ships. The smallest of them was larger than any structure human beings had ever built. They sat beyond the atmosphere like a row of closed doors, patient and silent, waiting out the clock. He thought about everything he knew about negotiation, about pressure, about the psychology of ultimatums. He had spent 30 years learning how people behaved when they were certain they had already won. He recognized the shape of this situation. He had been on the other side of it before, not against aliens, but against human enemies who had more men and more weapons and more money, and who had looked at him with exactly the same calm certainty that the outcome was already decided. Those enemies had all been wrong. He turned to Carla. "I need a meeting with the science division, the engineering course, and anyone we have with experience in unconventional warfare. Tonight. All of them." He picked up his cold coffee and finally took a sip. "We are not surrendering. But we are also not going to fight them the obvious way, because the obvious way will not work, so we need to think about this differently." Carla nodded. She had known Nathan for 6 years. She had seen him in bad situations before. She had never once seen him look the way he looked right now, not afraid, not angry, but deeply, quietly focused. And the way a man looks when he has accepted the size of a problem and decided that it does not matter. Outside, the lights in the sky did not move. The clock on the wall read 0611 hours. 72 hours had begun. Fleet Commander Isara had done this 411 times. That was the official count. 411 worlds absorbed into the Vorath continuum in the 6,000 years since the first expansion fleet left the home system. She had personally led 31 of those absorptions, which put her in the top tier of all fleet commanders currently serving. She knew how the process worked because she had run it dozens of times. It was not complicated. It was not even particularly interesting anymore. You arrived with overwhelming force. You made your broadcast. You waited. For the civilization below went through its predictable stages: panic, denial, debate, and then, finally, surrender. Every time, without exception. The only real variable was how long each stage lasted, and in Isara's experience even that had become fairly predictable once you factored in the size and age of the civilization. She stood at the observation lens of her command ship and looked at the blue and white planet below and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt uncertain. The 72-hour window had closed 14 hours ago. The humans had not surrendered. They had also not panicked, at least not in any way that suggested they were close to capitulation. Their military forces were mobilizing. Their orbital defense systems were being brought online. and their leaders were meeting in what appeared to be a hardened underground facility, which meant they were not running, they were planning. And they had sent exactly one communication in response to the Vorath broadcast. It was from someone with the title of Secretary General of something called the United Nations, and it said, in formal and polite language, that the terms of absorption were not acceptable, and that a counter-proposal would be transmitted within 24 hours. A counter-proposal. Isara had read that word 3 times to make sure her translation system had not made an error. Her tactical officer, a sharp and efficient young Vorath named Veth, pulled up the latest planetary scan and highlighted it across the display. "Commander, they are still mobilizing. Ground forces across all major land masses. At naval vessels departing ports. We are also detecting preparations for ballistic launches from 14 separate sites. Their weapons are primitive kinetic and chemical systems. They cannot damage our hull plating." "They know that," said Isara. Veth looked at her. "Commander?" "They are not a primitive species," she said. "They have radio telescopes. They have orbital technology. They have detected our hull composition from the ground. They know their weapons will not scratch us." She paused. "So why are they launching?" Her second-in-command, Orek, answered without looking up from his station. He had been with Isara for 12 years and had the comfortable manner of someone who no longer felt the need to be impressive. "Theater," he said. "They are showing their population that their leaders are doing something. It is a political performance. We have seen it before." "Have we?" said Isara. "From a species that already knows the performance is pointless?" Orek did not answer. Isara turned back to the observation lens. She had spent the past several hours reading the cultural analysis her intelligence division had prepared on humanity. It was thorough and detailed because the Vorath had been monitoring Earth's communications for a long time before making their approach, and the humans produced an enormous volume of communication. Books, broadcasts, recorded conversations, data transmissions. The Vorath had been listening and translating for 60 years. The cultural report ran to several hundred pages. What Isara kept returning to was a section near the middle of the document. It was titled, in her translation, "In Conflict and Continuity." It described how humans, over the span of roughly 10,000 years of recorded history, had fought wars against each other on a scale and frequency that was almost impossible to believe. They had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire civilization and had come very close to using them on multiple occasions. They had experienced the collapse of cities and empires and entire societies, and after every single one of those collapses, they had rebuilt, not once or twice, over and over in every part of their world, across every era of their history. The pattern was the same: destroy, suffer, remember, rebuild. The report noted, almost as a side observation, was that humans were the only species in the Vorath database that had developed a widespread cultural concept around the idea of voluntary self-sacrifice for the benefit of others. Not as an unusual behavior, as an ideal, as something admirable, as something that their stories celebrated and their children were taught to respect. They had a word for it that appeared in almost every language on the planet in one form or another. The report noted that this concept appeared to predate written language. It was not something they had learned. It was something they had always had. Isara set the document down and thought about that for a long time. Down on the surface, in the reinforced command facility beneath the Colorado Mountains, Nathan Graves was finishing a briefing that had lasted 4 hours. And the room was full of military commanders from 30 different nations, some present in person and some appearing on screens along the far wall. They were tired and serious, and they had spent most of the last 4 hours arguing, which Nathan had expected and allowed for. When the arguments ran out, he had their attention completely. "Their technology is far ahead of ours in most areas," he said. "Their ships are large, heavily armored, and their energy weapons can cut through anything we can build. A direct military engagement on their terms would end in about 40 minutes, and not in our favor." He let that sit for a moment. "That means we do not fight them on their terms. We fight them on ours." A general from the Brazilian forces asked what that meant specifically. Nathan nodded as if he had been waiting for that question. "Like it means we use what we are actually good at. Not the size of our weapons, not the strength of our armor. What we are good at is working around problems we cannot solve directly. Humans have been doing that since before we had cities. We find the gap, we go through it sideways, and we make it hurt enough that continuing to push becomes more trouble than it is worth." He turned to a section of the display that had been covered since the briefing began and uncovered it. It showed a classified project designation, 2 names, and a location in Nevada. Most of the people in the room had never seen those names before. A few had, and those few went very still. "There is a project that has been running for 11 years that most of you do not have clearance for," Nathan said. "As of today, you do. And once you understand what it does, I think you will see why we are not going to surrender." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet and matter-of-fact, the voice of a man who had already decided something and was now simply informing others of the decision. "Those ships up there are full of living creatures who have never once had anyone push back. They do not know what to do when someone pushes back. That is the gap. That is where we go." Back on the Vorath command ship, Isara was still staring at the planet below when the 24-hour counter-proposal window expired. 1 minute later, exactly on time, a transmission arrived from Earth. She opened it and read it slowly. Then she read it again. Then she called her science division and forwarded the attached 40-page document and told them she needed an assessment within 6 hours. But she sat back in her chair and thought about what she had just read. The humans were not begging. They were not pleading. They were offering a trade. And the thing they were offering was something the Vorath had been quietly desperate for 300 years. This, she thought, was not how this was supposed to go. The counter-proposal arrived at the Vorath fleet at exactly the time the humans had said it would. Isara noticed that first. In her experience, species under pressure did not keep their stated timelines. They scrambled. They asked for extensions. They communicated in bursts of desperate energy, followed by long silences. These humans had said 24 hours, and they had meant 24 hours, which was either a very good sign or a very strange one, and she was not yet sure which. And she read the document at her command console with Veth and Orek standing nearby. It was written in formal, careful language that was clearly composed by someone who understood diplomacy. It did not beg. It did not threaten. It acknowledged, plainly and without apparent embarrassment, that the Vorath held a significant technological advantage. It stated that humanity had no interest in being absorbed into the continuum under the current terms or any similar terms. And then, in the third section, it made an offer. The humans were aware of the vein. Isara stopped reading when she reached that line. She read it again. The vein was not a topic that appeared in any public Vorath communication. It was not something that had been broadcast on any frequency. It was a classified crisis, known only within the military and scientific cores of the continuum. A parasitic organism that had been consuming Vorath colony worlds at the outer edge of their territory for 3 centuries. Slow, patient, and so far completely unstoppable. The Vorath's best scientists had been working on a solution for 80 years and had produced nothing that lasted more than a season. The humans had attached a 40-page technical document to their proposal. It outlined a biological and chemical approach to neutralizing the vein organism. It was dense and detailed and written in the precise language of working scientists rather than diplomats. It was not a complete solution, but it was a serious one. It described 3 compounds that did not exist in Vorath chemistry, explained why they should work based on the vein's known biology, wherein proposed a field testing methodology. Isara forwarded it to her science division and told Chief Scientist Savek she needed an assessment in 6 hours. Savek came back in 5. The message was short. It said the human approach was unconventional but theoretically sound, that the 3 proposed compounds could potentially be synthesized, and that the field testing methodology was, and Savek used this word with visible reluctance, clever. Isara sat with that for a moment. Then she turned to Orek and said, "How did they know about the vein?" Orek had no answer. Neither did Veth. Neither did anyone else on the bridge. The truth was that the humans had been listening to Vorath communications for almost as long as the Vorath had been listening to theirs, an array of deep space receivers, and built in secret over the course of 20 years by a small team of astronomers and signal analysts who had suspected something was out there, had been intercepting Vorath encrypted transmissions for nearly a decade. The encryption had taken 6 years to break. What the team found inside, once they could read it, was a picture of an empire in quiet distress. Powerful, yes. Expanding, yes. But also dealing with something at its edges that it could not stop. The scientist who had first identified the vein problem in the Vorath data was a 34-year-old biologist named Dr. Patricia Nguyen. She had been working in a classified facility in Nevada that most of the world did not know existed, and she had been working on 2 things at once for the past 8 months. One was the vein problem, and the other was the device that everyone on her team called the door. Captain Denise Holt arrived at the Nevada facility on the 2nd day after the Vorath broadcast. She was 38, calm-faced, with the kind of steady quiet that comes from having been in genuinely dangerous situations often enough that it stops feeling like an event. She had commanded special operations units on 4 continents. She had been briefed on the Nevada facility 2 years earlier and told to wait for a situation that would make it relevant. That situation had arrived. Patricia met her at the entrance and walked her through the facility without any of the usual classified site formality. They passed through several rooms of equipment that Denise recognized not at all before they reached the main lab, and where a device the size of a large kitchen appliance sat on a reinforced table surrounded by wiring and sensor arrays and 3 young technicians who looked like they had not slept in days. "That is the door," Patricia said. Denise looked at it. "Walk me through what it does." Patricia explained it in plain language, the way she had learned to do over years of briefing non-scientists. The door created a temporary fold in local space that allowed matter to be transmitted from one point to another without physically crossing the distance between them. It had a range of 4 kilometers. It could not move anything larger than about half a cubic meter. It had been tested thousands of times, and it worked reliably on every molecular structure they had put through it. Organic material, metals, gases, liquids. All of it arrived at the target point exactly as it had left the source point. "How precise is the targeting?" Denise asked. "Within about 30 centimeters," said Patricia. "At 4 kilometers, that is very good." "Can you target inside a sealed structure?" "As long as we have the geometry of the interior." "Which," Patricia added, "we do. We have been analyzing the hull resonance of those ships since they arrived, and we have a reasonable map of the interior layout of at least 4 of them." Denise was quiet for a moment. "And the compound you have been working on, the vein research, is any of it useful for other applications?" Patricia looked at her steadily. "I have developed a compound that causes temporary unconsciousness in any known carbon-based biology. It is non-lethal. Effects last between 4 and 8 hours, depending on body mass. It disperses naturally and leaves no residue." She paused. "It was not originally designed for the Vorath, but it will work on them." Denise nodded slowly. "How long to have a deliverable quantity ready?" "I already have it," Patricia said. "I have had it for 6 hours. I was waiting for someone to come and ask the right question." Denise almost smiled. What made you think someone would? Patricia looked at the device on the table and then back at the captain. Because we are humans, she said simply. We always find a way to ask the right question eventually. We just sometimes take a little too long getting there. Back at the command facility in Colorado, Nathan was on the phone with the Secretary General, walking through the next phase of the plan. The diplomatic proposal was real. The offer regarding the vein was genuine. If the Vorath were willing to talk, humanity was willing to talk. But the talking was not going to be the only thing happening. The talking was one track. Patricia and Denise were another track. And Nathan had learned long ago that the best negotiations were the ones where the other side slowly realized, without being told directly, that they had already lost the option of not negotiating. He looked at the clock. He had a feeling the Vorath were about to start learning something about human beings that no cultural report had ever quite managed to capture. Not the stubbornness, not the history of conflict. Something simpler and harder to prepare for. The fact that humans, when they had decided on something, intended to do several things about it at exactly the same time. The Vorath continuum had rules about everything. Conquest had its own set of rules, developed over 6,000 years and refined with each new absorption until they were as smooth and reliable as any natural law. The rules existed because conquest was, at its heart, an economic exercise. Destroying a civilization before absorbing it was wasteful. Fighting prolonged battles was expensive in materials and crew and time. The correct way to absorb a new world was to demonstrate force so overwhelming that resistance became obviously pointless. Wait for the inevitable surrender, then move in and begin the integration process. The rules had never failed. There had never been a reason to question them. The rules said nothing about what to do if an enemy was negotiating on one level and doing something else entirely on a different level at the same time. The incident on the heavy cruiser VSS Tamarack began at 03:18 hours, ship time, on the fourth day after the Vorath broadcast. A crew member in the engineering section noticed a faint shimmer in the air near the starboard ventilation intake, the kind of visual distortion that might be caused by a heat fluctuation or a minor sensor glitch. She was about to log it as a maintenance note when the atmospheric sensors in that section registered a sudden drop in standard oxygen content, accompanied by the appearance of a compound that the ship's biosensors did not recognize. And they did not recognize it because it had not existed anywhere in the galaxy until Patricia Nguyen had synthesized it in a laboratory in Nevada 4 days earlier. The ventilation system, responding automatically to the detected atmospheric change, attempted to equalize the air composition throughout the lower 3 decks of the ship. This was exactly what Patricia had expected it to do. The compound spread through the ventilation network within 90 seconds. The crew members in those sections went to sleep where they stood. They did not fall dramatically. They sat down or leaned against walls or simply stopped moving. Some of them had time to look confused before their eyes closed. None of them were harmed. Their hearts kept beating. Their lungs kept working. They were, for all practical purposes, simply asleep, deeply and completely, and in a way that nothing they knew about could have caused. 40% of the VS Tamarack's crew was unconscious within 3 minutes of the compound's release. The ship's command functions continued to operate. Life support continued to operate. The vessel was intact and undamaged. It was also, for all practical purposes, unable to function because the people needed to run it were lying on the floor. At the same time, Denise Holt's unit ran the same operation on 2 other vessels in the fleet. The targeting data had been compiled by a young intelligence analyst named Greg Patel, 26 years old, who had spent 60 hours without sleep working through hull resonance scans and signal analysis to map the interior layouts of the target ships accurately enough that the door could place the compound within the ventilation systems rather than in open space. His targeting package was precise to within 20 centimeters. When he sent the final file, he put his head down on his keyboard and fell asleep immediately, still wearing his headphones, with a half-eaten sandwich next to his elbow. Isara received all three reports within minutes of each other. She stood at her command console and read them one at a time without expression. Then she stood very still for a while, which was a thing she did when she was thinking hard about something she did not yet understand. "How did they get inside our ships?" she said at last. Nobody on the bridge answered, because nobody knew. Veth ran a full external scan of all three affected vessels. No breach in the hull, no entry point, no foreign object detected anywhere on the exterior. Whatever the humans had done, they had done it without physically touching the ships. The compound had appeared inside sealed compartments, past layers of armor that no known weapon could penetrate, without leaving any evidence of how it had arrived. Orek looked at the scan results for a long time. "That is not possible," he said, in the tone of someone who was aware that they were wrong, but had not yet finished processing it. "Clearly it is," said Isara. She authorized a full medical response to all three affected ships. The unconscious crew members were monitored, assessed, and found to be in good health. As the hours passed and each one woke up, confused but unharmed, the picture became clearer. The compound was temporary. The humans had chosen a tool that incapacitated without killing. That was a deliberate choice, and Isara knew it, and she spent a long time thinking about what it meant that they had made it. The transmission from Earth arrived 90 minutes after the incident. It was not from the Secretary General. It was from a man who identified himself simply as Colonel Nathan Graves, and he spoke in the direct, unhurried manner of someone who was not trying to impress anyone or win an argument, but simply explaining a situation as clearly as possible. He acknowledged what had happened to the three ships. He confirmed that the crew members were unharmed and would remain so. He stated that the capability used was real and functional, and could be applied to every vessel in the Vorath fleet within a 4-hour window if the situation required it. He said this without apparent pride, the way a person describes a tool they happen to own. Then he said something that Isara would think about for a long time afterward. "We are not asking you to respect us," Nathan said. "We are asking you to work with us. Those are two different things. Right now, only one of them is available. The document we sent about the vein is real. The people who wrote it have been working on that problem for 8 months because we intercepted your transmissions and recognized something we understood. A species that is fighting something it cannot beat alone. We know what that is like. We are offering to help, but we will not be absorbed. That is not a position we will move from. Not today, not ever. We will give you 12 hours to think about the new terms. If you choose to push instead, we will make the next 12 hours difficult for your fleet. We would prefer not to do that. We think you would prefer it too." The transmission ended. The bridge was very quiet. Orek turned to look at Isara. He had been with her for 12 years, and she had never once seen him at a loss. He looked at a loss now. Not frightened, but genuinely uncertain in a way that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with being in a situation for which his entire life experience had not prepared him. "They intercepted our transmissions," he said. "For how long?" "Long enough to know about the vein," said Isara. "Long enough to develop a partial solution to it. Long enough to build whatever device they use today." She looked at the planet below, blue and white, and very calm against the blackness. "They have been preparing for us. Not since we arrived. For years. They saw us coming." Veth said quietly, "But they did not warn their population." "No," said Isara. "They prepared instead." She paused. "That is an important difference." She thought about the cultural report. She thought about 10,000 years of wars and collapses and rebuildings. She thought about a species that had learned, through its own long and brutal history, that warning people about a problem accomplished less than solving it. She thought about the concept the report had called sacrifice, and the related concept it had called strategy, and how, in the human record, those two things were sometimes the same thing. Yashi had 12 hours to respond. For the first time in her career, she was not certain what the right answer was. In Nevada, Patricia Nguyen was asleep on a cot in the back of the lab, fully dressed, with her glasses still on. Denise Holt was sitting outside on the steps of the facility in the cold desert night, looking up at the lights in the sky. They were still there, still steady, still holding their positions. But something had changed. She could not have said exactly what. It was more of a feeling than a fact. They felt less certain than they had before. The Vorath High Command deliberated for 11 hours and 42 minutes. Isara listened to the discussion from her command ship, connected to the council chamber by secure transmission, and saying very little and watching the faces of people she had known for decades as they worked through something none of them had ever had to work through before. There was anger in the room. There was embarrassment, which was perhaps more dangerous than the anger. There were voices that said the fleet should strike now, completely and without mercy, and reduce the human world to silence on principle alone. Those voices were loud at first. They got quieter as the hours passed, and the implications of the incident on the 3 ships were examined more carefully. The humans had penetrated sealed hulls without leaving a trace. They had done it with a precision that suggested not a rushed response, but a long-prepared capability. And they had chosen not to kill anyone. That last point was the one that caused the most argument, because it cut in 2 directions at once. It could mean the humans were merciful. It could also mean they were sending a message. We could have killed them and we chose not to, which means the next move is yours and we are watching to see what you do with it. Isara thought it was both. When the deliberation ended, the result was a document that the High Command called a strategic realignment of terms. It was not called a surrender, because the Vorath did not have a procedure for surrender and had no intention of inventing one. What it was, in plain language, was an agreement to leave Earth alone and to enter into a formal research partnership on the Vane crisis in exchange for access to the human scientific work and the cooperation of the scientists who had produced it. Full autonomy for Earth, no absorption, no reassignment of leaders, no integration into the continuum. Everything the humans had asked for. Isara transmitted the document to Earth herself, through the same channel Nathan had used. She added a short personal note at the end, outside the official record. It was brief and honest. It said that in 411 absorptions, across 6,000 years, the Vorath had never encountered a civilization that negotiated and acted on 2 separate levels at the same time, without giving any indication that the second level was happening. Her analysts were still trying to understand how it had been done. She asked if the humans were willing, whether they might be open to receiving a cultural observer at some point, not for strategic purposes, for genuine understanding. Nathan read the note at his desk in the Colorado facility. And he had been awake for 31 hours. He read it twice, then passed it to Carla, who read it and laughed for the first time in 4 days, a short, tired laugh that was mostly relief. "Tell them yes," Nathan said. "Tell them the observer is welcome, and tell them we are happy to explain everything." He paused for a moment. "Eventually." The Vorath fleet began withdrawing from Earth orbit at 0600 hours on the 8th day after their arrival. Carla watched from the observation deck, the same one where she had first seen them come through. The sky was pale blue and very cold, and the ships caught the early sun as they rose, their dark angular shapes going bright for a moment before they folded back through the tiers in the sky and were gone. The tiers sealed themselves behind them, slowly, like wounds closing. Within an hour, there was no sign they had ever been there at all, except in every photograph and video and news broadcast and social media post that the entire human race had been producing non-stop for 8 days. In Tulsa, Dale Cooper watched the coverage on the diner television and poured himself a third coffee and nodded once, slowly, with the satisfaction of a man whose estimate of a situation had turned out to be correct. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The debrief at Colorado took 3 days. Reports were written, protocols were established. Patricia Ingian went home, slept for 14 hours, woke up, and immediately started writing a more complete version of the vain research because she had thought of 2 additional approaches while she was asleep. And Greg Patel found a promotion waiting for him when he woke up at his desk, and the keyboard marks on his cheek were still visible in the official photograph taken that afternoon. Denise Holt submitted her after-action report in 8 concise pages and went back to her regular post, where she told anyone who asked that it had been a fairly standard operation and declined to say anything more than that. 3 weeks after the fleet withdrew, a Vorath cultural observer named Ireth arrived at a small airfield outside Washington. She was tall and silver-scaled and carried herself with the controlled formality of someone who was more nervous than she wanted to show. She had volunteered for the posting, which had surprised her superiors, because cultural observer assignments were usually given to junior personnel. Ireth was not junior. She was one of the most experienced intelligence analysts in the continuum. She had asked to come because she had read everything available about Earth and still did not understand it, and she found that condition uncomfortable enough to want to fix it personally. She was met on the tarmac by a man named Marcus Webb. He was 44, medium height, with an easy manner and the patient expression of a person who was genuinely interested in whatever was about to happen. He had spent 20 years teaching history at a high school in Virginia before being recruited for the liaison role, a choice that the selection committee had described as deliberate. They had not wanted a soldier or a diplomat for this job. They had wanted someone who knew how to explain things to people who did not already understand them, and who would not be rattled if the questions were strange. Marcus shook Ireth's hand, which she had not expected. He offered her coffee, which she declined. Then he said, "I thought we would start with the History Museum. I think once you see a few thousand years of what we have been doing to each other, the last couple of weeks will make a lot more sense." Ireth looked at him carefully. "Your species has a museum dedicated to its history of conflict?" "Several," Marcus said. "We find it useful to remember." The drive to the museum was short and quiet. When they arrived, Ireth stood for a long time in the first gallery, in front of a wall-length timeline of human civilization. It ran from the earliest stone tools to the present, dense with events, and most of the events it described were, in one way or another, about destruction. Wars, collapses, famines, plagues. Whole civilizations disappearing from the record, and then, always, something new appearing in their place. Not always better, not always smarter, but always present, always continuing. "You have been doing this for 10,000 years, Ireth said. Destroying and rebuilding." "Yes," said Marcus. "And it does not discourage you." Marcus thought about it honestly. "I think what might be hard to see from the outside," he said, "is that we have gotten very good at the rebuilding part. You can knock us down as many times as you want. We get up. That is not stubbornness. It is just what we do." Ireth stayed on Earth for 14 months. She traveled widely, asked questions that sometimes surprised P.